My name's Jen Charteris. I'm the Exec Director of an organisation called Crosslands, and we train people for ministry and for being Christians in everyday life. I'm here to lead this session on leading in complexity, and the reason why perhaps I might be deemed to have something to say on this is because of my background, which is about 30 years in management consulting, working for large UK corporations and government and other types of entities on leading complex change and complex programs. I had a particular specialism in running strategic alliances and joint ventures, which are just inherently complex because as soon as you bring two or more organisations together, things get really complex. And we'll talk about what I mean by complexity in a moment. And actually, the session after this, we'll be talking more specifically about partnerships. But I'm guessing that as in a group like this, you've been dealing with all sorts of previously unimagined complexities for the last couple of years. And many of you are still dealing with that, both pandemic fallout and in many cases, some of the unimagined disruptions that are beginning to sort of feed through from the conflict, the war in Ukraine. So I feel a bit humbled about that because I'm going to be talking in quite conceptual terms here, but aware that in your heads you're probably going to be thinking about some quite specific examples. The way I'd love to work this is to make this interactive. We're a small enough group, so if I'm covering something or we're at a particular point and you'd like to ask a question or make an observation, make a connection with something, I'd love it if we could turn this into a bit more of a conversation. But I have got prepared material, but very happy to pick up and pursue some of the areas of interest that you might be bringing to this question. Just to give you a little bit more structure, one of the things I'll spend a little bit of time on is the language and concepts to describe complexity, not because I'm wanting to be overly sort of academic or geeky about it, but actually when we describe a thing, when we name a thing, that usually is a gateway to better being able to manage or work with a thing. That actually goes right back to Genesis, but we know that also from our lives in leadership. There are a whole range of principles that we can pull out that help us to think about leading in complexity. And as part of that, I hope I'll also introduce you to some tools that might be useful to you in whatever complexity you lead. I wanted to begin by just putting some parameters on the sort of conditions in which we lead. So as leaders, things change around us. The conditions in which we are leading people, through which we are leading our organisations, change over time. And there are two particularly important dimensions that a number of researchers have sort of identified as playing very strongly into how you adapt your leadership according to the conditions. And I think one of our tasks as leaders is actually to understand, to learn how to read the conditions that we're in and to notice what's going on. And here are some parameters that might be helpful to you. The first is the degree of certainty and uncertainty. And we can all relate to this over the past couple of years and more. So an organisation, a community, a system can be either close to certainty, where we feel that things are working in a fairly predictable way, or they can be quite unstable, deeply unpredictable, far from certainty. So that's one particular dimension. The second dimension is the extent to which there is agreement in the community team system. So the extent to which people are aligned in their thinking, whether there's a consensus about how we should proceed in any set of circumstances. And you might be able to think of other dimensions, but these two I have always found enormously powerful, and they come from a particular body of research that helps us to give us a language for thinking about the state of our organisations. And how we might lead at different stages then starts to kind of map onto this landscape, onto this territory. So where things are fairly certain and where there's a high degree of agreement, we can adopt fairly conventional management and leadership approaches. You know, people can be allocated their tasks, and you can check in with them, and you can kind of hire with the long-term plan in mind. And so on. So all of those quite predictable, conventional ways, what we used to think of as conventional ways of leading organisations. Of course, no organisation is ever quite like that, and so things do get more complicated. Things become a little bit more unpredictable, or people become a little bit less well aligned, and so all of that starts to bring in a bit more complication. Far from agreement. Even when you're close to certainty, although that might sort of actually run quite a long way up the scale there, is where there is little agreement. I've used quite loaded terms here, but you often have to lead through influence, political decision making. You often find that there's a bit of coercion then starts to come in about how things should be done. I'm not really going to address that very significantly at all today. What we saw 2 years ago was a sudden loss of certainty. The pandemic hit us, and the conflict in Ukraine would be very similar, although I don't feel qualified to talk about that. But that moment of crisis, and something very interesting happens usually at the moment of crisis, certainly happening in our context, is that for a short time, actually everything moves close to agreement. So even if things had been, people had been misaligned, there'd been a lot of disagreement, actually for a short period of time, everything moves back this way as it shoots up the scale towards agreement. And there are certain permissions that leaders have at that moment of crisis. People need and want for leaders to be very authoritative, to make decisions, and so on. What I'm interested in now this afternoon is what happens next. And again, you've all got this live case study that you've been living through of what happens next, because that degree of alignment, agreement, doesn't last very long, does it? Yeah. So how many churches were split over policies on mask wearing, or how to approach different kind of uncharted decisions that had to be taken? Leaders have all been exhausted because you've been having to take decisions that you've not been prepared for. You haven't had a precedent for taking those decisions. And very easily, things can kind of spin out into chaos. But actually probably what's more been going on is that you've been existing in this kind of feeling like you're on the edge of chaos a lot of the time. So it's not quite chaos, it's not quite anarchy, but there is what technically in the literature on this is called bounded instability. And that's a really interesting phrase. So things are not falling apart, but they're inherently kind of a bit unstable. And that is another way of talking about that, is to talk about that as a zone of complexity. Now, a lot of the work I drew on from this, and this was material I used to work on with leaders of big organisations prior to the pandemic. It became suddenly very, very relevant when we hit this, but it's going on for your organisations at different times always. One of the biggest challenges, how do we lead in the midst of complexity? But there's a whole body of work that's done on the nature of complexity. For those of you who are into this kind of thing, it's if you're into chaos theory and complexity theory and so on, it's a whole world of things. It's a useful descriptor of the way we often experience the world. Here are some of my observations about this kind of grid that we're creating. One is that I think we're actually never as close to agreement or certainty as we might like to think we are. And what we've seen going on in most of our societies recently is loss of certainty exposes differences that were hidden. In other words, the loss of certainty actually exposed disagreement that we managed to push aside and not think about or just gloss over. And actually that some of those differences have been brought out even in our churches in some cases. And actually the loss of agreement gives rise to new uncertainties. You know, if people are suddenly split on really important decisions, that creates a whole new set of instability for a church community, for the organisation we're leading, and so on. So really what I'm trying to say here is there's this very dynamic interplay between these factors. And as leaders, no wonder we've all been a bit tired because we're trying to first of all understand what's going on here, and then secondly, trying to work out how we lead in the face of all of that. So question to you, where in all of this do you find the greatest potential for innovation? So although it feels a really tough place to be, the very fact that things have become a bit unfrozen, the way things always were, now is no longer reliable or adequate. I was going to say legitimate. I mean, it's still legitimate for the right circumstance, but suddenly all the things that we were kind of committed to and kept in place have been thrown up in the air and shown to not be either capable of holding us up or inadequate for their purpose. And so you end up, whilst this is a very tough zone to be in, actually it drives us to innovate. And I'm guessing if we had time, we could go around this room and discover all sorts of innovations that you've made over the past couple of years in the organisations that you lead, some of which will actually bring lasting changes, perhaps in a way that might have otherwise taken you 5 years to drive through as an organisation. I know, for example, some theological education providers where the leadership has wanted to do more online stuff for years and years and years and hasn't been able to get the faculty to agree to do that overnight online. So you know, forced innovation perhaps, and it's not guaranteed to be sustainable or necessarily even ideal. But there is huge opportunity that comes out of being in that kind of space. Which leads us to this question of, well, how might we lead well when things are truly complex? So I've talked about some of these definitions. So in conventional, fairly predictable circumstances, we want to achieve, and we know what we want to achieve and output and so on. So good management, and let's not underplay the value of good management. A lot of us are kind of keen to do the more exciting, innovative stuff, but actually there are a lot of things and times and seasons and situations in which really simple routines of plan, do and review serve you really, really well. And I think those are often undervalued in a Christian organisation kind of context. Where it gets more complicated, I think what I mean by that is there are multiple dimensions. They take a lot of coordinating, but they're interacting in fairly predictable conditions. So my background, I would think of running a major infrastructure program. There are things that are not entirely within your control, but there are always kind of ways in which you can mitigate that. And there you need good program management. And again, I'd love us to see us valuing really, really good program management skills. I think organising something like ELF is in this category of complicated. There are a lot of moving parts, and with a huge amount of very good program management, the parts come together, and because it's well done, everybody is able to participate much more kind of fluently and in more of a relaxed, engaged way. So you're managing knowable risk there. The crisis piece is what we talked about, sudden loss of certainty, and then you get briefly a quick alignment. I worked for a bank in the UK for a while that had a run on the bank. It was a very high-profile case at the start of the financial crisis some years ago, and really interesting kind of routines and so on that came out of that about what to do in a crisis, including some really interesting things about what sort of person you want in control. at that moment of crisis, which I can chat about offline if anyone's interested. But you need some authority, clarity, and decisiveness. But actually, you've got to be able to cope with multiple inputs at that moment in time. But then we move into this complexity with constant change and little consensus and so on. We're coming on to that. As we get into how do we lead in this, I just want to invite you to do a thought experiment. So I don't know if this applies in all the cultures represented in the room, but certainly in my culture there is a saying that says knowledge is power, and we value knowing very much, and we promote people in organisations for their knowledge and expertise. The thought experiment is to say, what if not knowing was also a good thing? What if there was a way in which taking a posture of not being certain of the answer was a virtue? Is this making any sense at all? So a posture of not knowing. What happens if you actively take the posture of not knowing? So I'm not talking about just being ignorant and kind of not knowing information you should know, but approaching a situation saying, I do not know exactly how all this is working. What happens next? It makes us curious. That's really what you're describing there. So, I can panic about what I don't know, but if we trust that the Lord is in control here, and we have a sense that I might not know all the answers because, you know what, I'm not God, and only God knows everything. Actually not knowing takes us to a place of, first of all, prayerful dependence and also curiosity to say, well, what might I need to find out? Who might have part of the answer? What are the possible contributions that we might be able to get in to make that decision? So it's an interesting concept. If we embrace our human limitedness, and so I'm not talking about fallenness here. We are created. Our created humanity is deliberately limited. We are not God, and actually situations of complexity cause us to realize that. It causes us to realize and recognize our limits, and then creates a whole lot of opportunities for us to collaborate with other people in working through to act in that situation. What I was holding back from saying is that I was avoiding using the term solutions, because in the nature of complexity, truly complex situations actually don't have solutions. As in, they don't have, like, you're not going to ever get this done. You're never going to nail it. It's always going to be a kind of open-ended, emerging thing that keeps developing over time without ever being able to beautifully resolve the solution. And some of us are wired in such a way that we really want the solution, and so we rush in and try and fix it. But actually, God doesn't intend us to fix everything. He intends us to live with the conditions that He has given us. Let me introduce you to this framework for thinking about it. Some of you might have come across the idea of a ladder of abstraction. Don't worry if you haven't. I think it has its origins in linguistics. So the idea is that some language that we use is very abstract, and some language that we use is very, very concrete. Like I can say, my hand, that's quite concrete. Idea is more abstract. But we can also apply this to some of the things that are shaping and driving our organisational life or our community life. And what we have at the sort of more abstract level is worldview, in our case a biblical worldview, which is, we don't have it written down in front of us all the time. We do have it in God's word, but it shapes a way of thinking for us, which transfers into values, which we turn into principles and goals as leaders, and drives the policies that we set and the decisions that we make, and all of that results in practice on the front line. But what's worth recognizing for us as Christians, and this is where we have just an extraordinary gift for being able to navigate complexity, is that our worldview and values are enduring because they are biblically shaped. I think a lot of people have had their worldview completely rocked in the last few years, and we have not. Praise God, we know that he is on his throne and his purposes are being fulfilled, even if we don't fully understand what those purposes are. So we have enduring and biblically shaped values. What's happened on the day-to-day on the ground has all been disrupted and unpredictable. But part of our role as leaders is to work on what joins those two ends of the ladder, if you like. So we have needed, if you're a leader, a board member, a pastor, you've needed to revisit and reassess and reform and restate different principles and goals, and different policies, different decisions have had to adapt. But they're adapting within the frame of our biblical worldview. So it really is a very different way to approach the instability and complexity. We have a much better basis for being able to navigate all of this. There are certain things. Some of you will be familiar with, there's a hymn in English. It says, "I cannot tell." Do you know this hymn? It says, "I cannot tell basically exactly how God will do everything." So the first part of each verse goes, "I cannot tell, I cannot tell." And then the second half of each verse says, "But this I know." And that's a wonderful summary of our Christian worldview. There's lots that we can't tell, but this we do know, is that Christ is reigning and interceding for us, and God will see his purposes fulfilled. And so we can cope with the disruption much better because we have that anchor holding everything together. So I've found that working with boards and things over the last couple of years a really, really helpful kind of framework for saying, what territory do we need to be in? We need to spend time restating and holding these out and reminding people of these. We've got to give people permission to try things out over here. And we, as leaders, we help to frame that and give it boundaries by framing it, the principles and goals and so on that drive it. Just thinking about this, so what are some of the other ways some of the ways we help to do this kind of not knowing to these? Well, I've got three metaphors for you: street corners, salad bowls, and magnets. Street corners, very simply, is this idea that, and this is, sorry, brother, what's your name? Emmanuel. Yeah. So really, part of what Emmanuel was referring to is the idea that if I can't possibly know all the answers, then it's a really good idea to ask people who may have other perspectives on a thing. And the idea that if we see like a road traffic accident or an incident of some kind happen, you'll see a slightly different point of view depending on which street corner you were standing on, and actually you'll get a more accurate view of the whole if you have people talking from all four street corners. And so during the pandemic, for instance, my husband was really, as a church pastor, he was really intentionally kind of convening conversations with people with different connections and points of view, people who were dealing with homeschooling kids and people who were in danger of losing their jobs and various other things, to hear those points of view about how we could be serving one another well as a church family. So listening for different perspectives. But that can become a bit of a free-for-all, so you can have lots of different inputs and then it just becomes, completely overwhelming. So this is where we need a salad bowl. And by salad bowl, I mean some sort of a container. So, we're not saying we'll do everything that anybody wants. What we want to say is, by a salad bowl or a container, we mean something that helps to bring cohesion. Remember, cohesion is one of the things we want to try and increase. A good question can act as a container. So a question that says, how can we make sure that we are interacting with each member of the church family, preferably every week, and if not every other week as a minimum. So that's not a kind of what are all the hundreds of things people want us to do, which would just knock you over as a pastor. It's rather the question of how could we sort of achieve this broad goal, and then people contribute ideas, and it gives organisation to the thinking. Something like even a meeting, a room acts as a container. We come together as a meeting, and a meeting with a good agenda is a really good salad bowl, a really good container, because it it says to people, here are the things that we're here to discuss, and gets focus and attention on shared things. A badly chaired, badly prepared meeting is hopeless. It's a waste of everybody's time because you end up all over the place. So there are really intentional things we can do as leaders to provide containers. So a good question to be asking yourself when things are unstable is, what might act as a good container for this discussion? Having a book group where you choose the book, and then the book acts as a sort of parameter for the kind of discussions that you might have, and so on. So that's the salad bowls. And then magnets, I'm going to do a bit of a deeper dive into the idea of magnets. So the thing about a magnet is that it's got two opposite poles, right? It's got north and the south pole. And you need both of those to make it work. You need them held, they need to be part of the same. And very often we take quite sort of seemingly opposite things and play them off against one another, when actually part of our job as leaders is actually to hold those two things together. I'm going to go into this in quite a lot more detail. I talked about a great question can act as a container. I think, it's just a kind of sidebar opinion, is that the ability to frame great questions and then help people to engage in answering them is a really, really underrated leadership skill. So thinking about what questions you pose to people can be a really powerful intervention without you having to know the answer. So, how could we, just thinking of an example, how could we better love the older people in our congregation, for example? You don't know the answer to that, but it acts as a focal point and helps get people's energy and attention and creativity and innovation onto the question. So be a good framer of questions. Now, I talked about the magnet, and we're going to do a little bit more on this. So polarities, as I said, are interdependent pairs that need each other over time. So you've got these seemingly opposing approaches, but actually they're both necessary for a system to function well. Let me take an example. So activity and rest, seemingly opposite, right? Actually, the Bible tells us we need both. And guess what? We're made to need both, even though they seem to be opposite one another. And so if I found myself in a position where I've overdone activity at the expense of rest, then what I need is to rest. What happens if I overdo rest at the expense of activity? Dare I say, this was my dear father in his older years. Boredom, health, physical health, actually. If I'm overdoing rest at the expense of activity, my health will deteriorate. My relationships will probably deteriorate. So actually you see some of the same effects coming from a completely different angle. And so what we need is this kind of healthy interplay of activity and rest. And part of our job as leaders is to spot where there are these polarities, I'm calling them, and recognize, learn to assess what the balance is looking like and how we might help our system to be more balanced and accurate in managing those. Here are some examples that we've perhaps seen over the last couple of years. So tension between action and reflection. We've felt the pressure to do something, and perhaps haven't always reflected, and sometimes we've been forced to not do anything, and we've spent too long reflecting and get a bit depressed, and so on. Safety and risk is a huge one, absolutely huge. Safety, what precautions do we take to stop people catching COVID and so on, and at the same time, is it worth the risk to meet up because we desperately want to meet, and so on. Safety and risk can be a psychological safety and risk thing as well in a lot of communities and organizations. Actually, if people feel appropriately safe, they will take more appropriate risks. So you actually get more of both if you do them well. So you get this kind of virtuous cycle going on. For leaders, confidence and humility can appear to be opposite to one another, but actually we need leaders to have both. Structure and freedom, I think, is another one that sits there strongly. Innovation and tradition, the parts and the whole, the one, the many, unity, diversity, stability, change, and so on. What's really interesting about this is that right from creation, actually God holds these together. God is these integrated. He is one and many. He is power and love, and he is, in the way he creates, there is both beauty and order. He doesn't drive a wedge between these things or sort of drive them apart. This is in the very nature of God, that he holds these things together. Not everything is a polarity, but it just, thinking for yourselves about some of the tension. I know that in a lot of churches, in our context at the moment, for instance, where a lot of churches have grown very unexpectedly through the pandemic. Some have really struggled as well. But where churches have grown, the tension is between kind of structure and sort of order and relationship. How do you formalize things to help them to kind of grow and work well, and so on, but not lose all the relationships and the kind of interpersonal connection. And so there are a lot of pastors I see who are wrestling with that as a seeming tension, but actually seeing them as things that we need to have both of. Will often resolve, some church councils or organisational leadership groups will have real debates about, we're becoming too, we don't need all this structure, or everything's too informal, and you have these kind of debates. It's actually how can we do both of those? It's a very different kind of question to be asking and to lead people through, and so we need to be actively maintaining them because it's dynamic. You'll need to keep adjusting on those. Does that make sense as a concept? If this resonates with you as something that you kind of think, I need to do this, there's some work. There's lots of stuff online that you can find about this, and you can find this kind of map that actually helps you work through a process of really analysing some of the polarities at work and what effects they're having and what you might do about them. But and I just want to point out in relation to this, it's one of many examples where the management and organisational research and literature comes out with this really exciting new concept, which actually, the Bible's got, and we should, we should think very carefully about the models and tools and frameworks that we adopt that come from a secular background. But actually, many of them, they'll always be limited. Because they'll never see the problem of human sinfulness seriously enough, and they'll never see the hope of redemption clearly enough. But actually, they are sort of trying to deal with both of those issues, and there's so much common grace in these. But usually, for a really good model, you'll go, yeah, the Bible's always had that, and what they've done here is drawn it in a way that works for our modern sensibilities. So that's a bit of a sidebar on how we think about and use some of the management literature. What I wanted to do was just take some principles, really, that these overlap quite a lot, but hopefully act as some useful ideas. Now, this is a strange term if you haven't come across it before. Cultivate negative capability. Has anybody come across this term, negative capability, before? It's not a negative term. It speaks of the ability to live with a bit of ambiguity, to live with things not being solved, to live with things being a bit open-ended. Some people, by nature, by character, are kind of naturally drawn to leaving things open-ended, but actually, certainly in the kind of cultural context I've operated in, a very high premium is placed on sorting it, fixing it, closing it out, completing it. This idea of closure is a strong driver certainly in some cultures. What negative capability is about is is the ability to step back, not in a lazy, passive way abdicating your responsibility, but rather a way of saying, let's just take one little step forward and see what happens, as opposed to trying to fix the whole thing and potentially making it worse. So let's live with the fact that these two things don't quite resolve with each other, and just see see whether we can understand it better by taking a little bit more time. So that's the idea of negative capability. It's kind of another way, it's a really clever way of saying stay curious rather than rush to close and rush to solve. And with that goes something we've already talked about, really, the idea of collective intelligence. Weight that more than individual genius. The leader who wants to make their impact, to be seen to have the solutions, either out of anxiety or out of arrogance, will often make things worse, whereas a group of people really working something through together are likely to see more options and a richer solution. Which means asking questions more than priding yourself on knowing the answers. Getting okay with not knowing the answers is just such an important kind of mindset shift for these kinds of conditions. It's also interesting as a sidebar, as people go through leadership sort of stages, go into more senior leadership, certainly in the corporate world, and perhaps in church leadership as well. You've kind of got to this stage by knowing a lot, and you've been valued up to here for knowing a lot. But I promise you, if you keep trying to get into more senior levels of responsibility by knowing everything, you will fall over because you cannot. And so the skill set switches to being much better at asking questions and bringing collective intelligence together, which requires the ability to reflect more than to just react to things. It puts a lot of emphasis, therefore, on relationships more than on structures. And one of the things we're trying to foster, I think, is constructive dissent rather than destructive consent. So a lot of people hear English, not your first language. Let me explain. Destructive consent means people kind of saying they agree, but not really agreeing. And actually that becomes quite destructive. So they go out of the room after the meeting and say, well, I said yes, but I didn't really agree, or, I'm not going to go along with it. Whereas if you cultivate a culture in your leadership team, in your organization, where it's seen as a helpful and constructive thing to disagree, dissent, to express concern or reservations about a decision, then actually you have a much better decision. One of the senior government people I worked with was well known for the fact that in his leadership team, if everybody agreed really quickly, he'd kind of go, well, we're not moving on until we've heard some other points of view on this. So he made it a virtue to bring another point of view to a discussion. That's what constructive dissent means. And giving people purposes and parameters rather than trying to control the details. So this is a container idea, actually. So saying what we're trying to do is this, and don't do any of that. But if you're trying to achieve that and not doing any of that, then do it however is going to be best in those circumstances. So you give people freedom within a boundary, and that can be very valuable. And then another funny phrase, which is positive deviance. The idea of positive deviance is people who are somehow making an impact, even though they're not doing it the same way as everybody else. So if everybody's doing it the same way and not really getting anywhere, but then there's somebody over here who's tried something different and they're making progress, pay real attention to that. This actually is an idea that comes apart from other places, perhaps out of the development world, where you're discovering that there are some communities or families who somehow flourish in the same conditions, despite, and perhaps they've got a different attitude to something or a different routine or something that is just helping them to flourish more than others. And what you do is you pay attention to that and say, how can we help more people to do and understand that? We talked about the ladder of abstraction. So learn to be tight on vision, but flexible on the routes to get there. So, you know, what happens with a rocket is you set the you kind of set the destination, you load it up with fuel. Of course, nowadays we do have the ability to guide them as they go along. I do know a bit about rockets. It is rocket science. But really we want to give somebody a map in all terms and a destination and say, look, you know, if you get to this bridge and it's closed, then find another way, rather than make them kind of check back for every step. So it's that sort of ideas. And with that comes simple rules that give people boundaries. There's a whole field of thinking about simple rules that we could talk about, but I won't delve into that now. But, you know, for example, you can say to people, look, focus on this outcome, keep it as simple as you possibly can, and make sure you involve other people. So that would be the kind of simple rules that would guide people and give them freedom within those parameters. There's a really interesting body of work called the Lean Startup approach. If some of you would be familiar with Lean as a methodology, the idea of a Lean Startup is you work out what you're trying to achieve, but then you take this almost the kind of smallest viable experiments you can. You do a little bit, and then you look at what's happened and what's worked and what you've learned from that, and then you might do some more experiments, and so you do this kind of rapid test and feedback. I think it's a brilliant way to innovate in general, but it's particularly important in the context of great uncertainty, because actually each time, as you are experimenting, the conditions are changing, and so you have greater ability to adapt. There's a methodology called appreciative inquiry, which is essentially asking the question, when something's working, what's going on, why does it work, and how does it work, what's going on when something works. So again, very often we're trained to kind of say, what are all the problems here, why did it go wrong? We're not necessarily as good as asking the question about, why did it work? Why is that particular home group really thriving? You know, why did this set of relationships for our organisation go well when we struggled on this set of relationships? Let's have a look at what's working. So again, there's a huge body of material there. If that catches your attention, something you can go and dig into and find out more about. I think using metaphor at times like this is really powerful. You know, giving people a sort of bigger sense of what you're trying to do without having to spell out all the rational detail, because sometimes you just don't have that detail. And very, very important to foster a sense of belonging, helping people to feel secure, giving people a part to play, all of that sort of thing, because it is about relationships and keeping people engaged so that they can contribute to moving forward, if not solving the problem. So just so those are just some of the practicalities.